We are thrilled tonight to welcome Clare Hanrahan and her memoir, The Half-Life of a Free Radical, Growing Up Irish Catholic in Jim Crow, which I think is one of the best book titles I've heard all year. Clare is an Asheville, North Carolina author, which I'm thinking many of you know. I guess I can see this better from my glasses. She's an activist, an organizer, and a speaker who has been participating in and reporting on direct action events throughout the southeastern United States for decades. She is an associate member of Veterans for Peace 099, a contributing editor to War Crimes Times, an affiliate of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. Try to say that fast. Hanrahan is a lead organizer with the New South Network of War Resistors and is active with the SOA Watch and the Western NCACLU. Clare was raised in Memphis, as her title indicates, and has lived and worked for peace and justice in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Florida. She served a 6-month sentence in Alderson Federal Prison in 2001 and 2002 for peaceful protest at Fort Benning, Georgia. She is the author of Jailed for Justice, A Woman's Guide to Federal Prison Camp. So without further ado, let's welcome Clare.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Well, let's turn it on.
That's a good idea.
Don't be afraid.
So my thanks to Cindy, to Malaprops, to all the crew here who are forever supporting independent publishers, writers, and we should in turn support independent booksellers. Oh, I see my book cover designer here, Jerry Strozier, over in the corner. So if you like that cover, there she is. And thank you all for coming out. There's a lot of familiar faces here, and my anxiety is reducing immediately. We all have stories to tell, and all our stories matter. I'll give you a little bit of my own story. My family in Memphis in 1950s and 60s. A little bit about the history prior to that time when my family arrived, around the time of the Reconstruction, the Civil War. My great-grandfather was a Union soldier, came down and fought the Battle of Shiloh and landed in Memphis. And he soon hooked up with a much younger Virginia girl who came down to Memphis as well. That was like in the late 1860s, early 70s. I want to talk a little bit about the institution of racism that I experienced as a child and I witnessed and was poisoned by, as we all are, and some of the other social and institutional forces that shaped me into the kind of person I've become, for good or worse. You know, we never know. Whether we're reacting to a whole system, whether we've absorbed the pain of generations and are acting on that. So this is my story, and thanks for listening. I have about 28 slides, and I'm going to intersperse them with some brief readings from the book. If you want more, this will give you an idea of what's going on in here. So, Memphis's name translates as place of good abode, though much of its history, of course, tells a different story. The Mississippi River you see there flows wide and deep past my hometown. I've known those muddy waters through many seasons. Memphis parks evoke the racist past. The only park I knew in Memphis that didn't honor a Confederate general was Tom Lee Park. Have you all heard of Tom Lee? Some of you have heard of Tom Lee. He was described in the plaque there you see on the right as a very worthy Negro, as if such bravery were the exception for people of color. Lee pulled more than 30 screaming white people from the raging waters of the Mississippi after a ship overturned in 1925. Well, I've lost what I was going to say about Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, but you see he had a park in his own name. That statue was erected in the mid-1964 in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. If you can wrap your head around that. The Memphis Flyer is a monthly paper much like our own Deer Mountain Express. And one of the writers there I recently read, she said, we have a responsibility to reckon with the whole history of our home places, even the stories deliberately left out of the history books. And believe me, there were many. In my research, I learned a whole lot about my city. Memphis' founder, Andrew Jackson, you know about his ruthless Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. And that Indian Removal Act had the effect of expanding the southern plantations, which were built on the back of slave labor, enslaved people. And the KKK's founder, Nathan Bedford Forrest, still rides his bronze horse in Memphis. He was a slave dealer. Not by many accounts, not a very nice guy, but honored because of his heroism in war by many people who celebrate war. I can't talk about Memphis and my life there in the 50s and 60s without also writing about my ancestors. So a good deal of this is those who came before. There's a Union veteran, George Gardner, came down from Indiana during the Civil War and fought in the most bloody battle of the war at Shiloh. And the young Virginia woman he married, there she is, my great-grandmother. And below whoops, this thing's in the way. That's my grandmother, Novetta, and my grandfather, Thomas Donnelly. Now, the Donnelly family on the right, the Donnellys and the Duffys survived the Great Hunger in Ireland. Y'all know about that? Terrible, terrible, terrible suffering. But they came to this country and they became railroad workers, and they built that railroad down from the north, where they landed, probably in Pennsylvania, all the way down to Tennessee. In the mid-1800s, I'm reading now, race from the bottom, the Irish joined people of color in what has been called the common culture of the lowly. They soon discovered that the surest way to gain employment advantage in America required that they be seen as whites. It's really sad learning about the history and the collusion by Irish immigrants and the oppression of people of color. Despite the pleadings of the great liberator Daniel O'Connell from Ireland, who wrote to the Irish in America and said, stand with the abolitionists. But for the most part, they did not. In Memphis in 1866, there was a massacre. The police department was in collusion by most accounts. Most of the police were Irish. There was a great deal of difficulty between the Irish and the soldiers, the black soldiers who had been released from their time in the Civil War, who were also patrolling streets with weapons. So, you know, there was a little bit of tension created there. Now, in the New York draft riots of 1863, those were pretty horrific too, and those were, for the most part, perpetrated by a lot of Irish just off the ship looking for work, left a starving country. What they discovered was that if they were Irish, they could be immediately drafted into the Civil War. If they were black, they were not considered citizens, and so they were exempt from the draft. If they were rich, they could pay $300. So you can understand that stirred up a little unhappiness. It's sad, I said, learning of the collusion. And you see the caricatures of the time, the Irish and the black, there were some pretty ugly words used to characterize them. The Irish were called Negroes turned inside out, and blacks were derisively called smoked Irish. And that was going on back in the time. My New York relatives who settled in Brooklyn were there at the time of those riots, but we never heard the story, so I don't know. My paternal great-great-grandparents in the Hanrahan and O'Shea family, they came across right before the Great Hunger was at its worst, and they arrived and settled in Brooklyn. And their grandson, Daniel Gerard, my father, and my mother, Alice Donnelly, she was born and raised in Memphis, third generation Memphis. So it took the mobilizations of World War II for the New York, New Jersey, Hanrahan, Mahoney clan of my father to connect in Memphis with the Tennessee, Gardner, Donnelly clan of my mother. The Donnellys fled, well, those who fled Ireland did so. The poorest among the immigrants who made the transatlantic crossing endured horrific conditions. They had a lower priority than baggage or livestock. As many as 2,000 people crowded onto an open deck in all weather, clinging to each other to avoid being washed overboard. But more about the history. We Memphis children in the 50s were not taught the history of independent and fearless women like Ida B. Wells. You've all heard of Ida B. Wells? What about Mary Harris, Mother Jones? They lived within miles of my great-grandmother's home place in the oldest neighborhood in Memphis, and called the Pinch. Ida B. Wells was so brave, she challenged, well, her whole family was wiped out by the yellow fever, and she began as an editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headline. And it was one of the most stirring newspapers, and I'm sure my grandmother, who was a contemporary of hers, my great-grandmother, pardon me, could not help but have known this woman. Nor could she have missed Mary Harris, Mother Jones. Her whole family, too, was lost to that yellow fever that wiped out Memphis. So it's good to know on what ground I was walking and who had walked before. When my parents arrived in Memphis in 1952, they came, Daddy on the right there with his first two sons, Daniel and Thomas. Daddy was Brooklyn educated at Fordham and St. John University Law School, and he joined the Army, or the Army joined him. So first they they came to Asheville. He was actually employed in the Grove Arcade, and that was part of the Army Weather Bureau, I believe. This was the Memphis's first Catholic worker house. Catholic workers are sort of Christian anarchists coming through the writings and teachings of Dorothy Day. I stood at my mama's knee for the blessing of Memphis's first Catholic worker house, serving what they called so-called Negro families who labored in the cotton fields. Every day, buses would go by our home filled with laborers, men and women. And many had to leave their children alone and unattended in Memphis. There was simply not the kind of help. So this early effort, which was rather bold at the time because, you know, what they called race mixing then was not legal. Certainly it was prohibited by custom, tradition, and the kind of hatred that prevailed. So I think my mom and dad were brave, don't y'all? 1952. The extent of the institutional racism used to shape and sustain the oppressive treatment of color in Memphis is startling to discover. I just was kind of shocked at the kind of polluted sea I was swimming in as a child. But you look here, always there was resistance. On the left-hand side, don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom. That's 1952 as well. The Regional Council of Negro Leadership. But countering that, Hambone's meditation appeared on the front page of the newspaper every day. I think the antidote for such pervasive poison was the continual dose of respect for the dignity of all that our parents taught by example throughout our childhood. The Commercial Appeal ran a daily cartoon called Hambone's Meditation. Hambone was a caricature of a Negro, balding, wearing baggy pants, and sometimes a defeated-looking hat. He was always engaged in some menial activity, such as bringing an armload of wood or sweeping and dusting. We even had our own censors in Memphis. Back to this earlier one. That's Helen Caldwell Day. She was a nurse. She was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi, same place where Ida B. Wells was born and came from. Helen went up to New York City, met Dorothy Day, came back down, decided she'd start a Catholic worker house. Looked up my mom and dad because they were on the list. Helen was the first woman of color to come into our home, not as a domestic worker, but as a friend and colleague of our parents. Sometimes she brought her 6-year-old son, Butch, who was recovering from polio. When Mama and Helen rode the bus together, they made a point to sit side by side in the center seat, just in front of that painted white line that marked the back of the bus. There was a quiet challenge to the Jim Crow laws of the day. Correct. White people not allowed in the zoo on Wednesdays. We went to the zoo a lot. It never really occurred to me until I saw that sign. This is Ernest Withers took that picture. He was one of the great photographers of the Civil Rights Movement. Unfortunately, some say now he was in the pay of the FBI. We had a Methodist minister who lived next door. He was a little uneasy with it. And a little later, when my brothers would go on the front porch and trade Marvel comic books, Spider-Man, and all of those wonderful old comic books, trade them with our neighbors. Because in Memphis, the apartheid, there were separate places and certainly unequal, but we were blocks apart. And the distinction in the housing and access was very different. But no, we never got a cross burned in our yard. There was a more subtle way of doing it. There's a culture of racism. I was just 10 or 12 when I noticed the social order and then it began to shift, but it would take until 1963 before all Memphis public facilities were desegregated. But it was another 50 years later before, when the African American population reached 63%, did the Memphis City Council vote to remove the Confederate names from city parks. Well, lo and behold, who comes to town? The daughters of the sons of the Confederacy came, and they were none too happy when the KKK joined them. And the police, the KKK had to sit in the back of the bus to be transported to the event. I thought that was a pretty neat little juxtaposition there. Let's see if I can find a little one. Someone tell me if I'm halfway through or not.
You've got 2 minutes to be in halfway
Oh,
through.
great. Reading from my section of the book called From the Bus Window, I could catch a glimpse of life on the other side of the color line from the bus window. The injustice was everywhere evident. Weary-looking women with several children in tow and young and old men alike were all crowded to the back of the bus behind the cruel line that divided passengers by the color of our skin. I always felt uneasy, taking my place in a front seat. I knew something was very wrong. Children do know. Children know. I don't know if my inherent sense of the injustice of what I witnessed would have been sufficient to withstand the dominant racist culture had it not been for the validation of our parents' guidance and example. Their wise recognition of the dignity of all persons helped to equip me and my siblings with the courage and confidence to challenge the attitudes of our peers. But it also set us apart. So good to see all y'all here. Yeah, feels real good. Okay, we endured the taunt of N-lover. It's a word we were forbidden to use, but it was present everywhere. What word? The N-word. We endured the taunt of that from our friends, from our neighborhood playmates, and the rebuke of grown-ups who, in less crass words, clearly conveyed their disapproval. 1960 was a census year. So that's really the only picture we've got of all of us together. You see us all? And that's a little house we all lived in. 2-bedroom with my grandpa too. We had a rollicking good time.
But you had a whole attic.
Excuse me?
You had a whole attic for the kids to sleep.
Yes, we all slept up in that attic there. Sometimes that was warm. The year 1960 was a census year. Mama must have known that a photographer and reporter from the Commercial Appeal would be coming to our home because she had us all get dressed in our Sunday clothes. We children crowded around our parents in the tiny living room for one of the few photographs we have with all of us together, from 14-year-old Mary Alice to the youngest Robert, who was about 4. The hook of the news story was the fact that Mama could not fit all her children on the census form that year. In the photo, Mama is seated, pen in hand, filling out the form. One of the census questions asked, "Did you work any time last week?" Mama's answer was telling. "I rise every day about 6 a.m. and work about 3/4 of the time until near midnight. That's about 16 hours a day and times 7 for the week." She didn't mince words, my mom.
Is your daddy counting you?
Apparently, yes. Everybody knew he could hold his liquor. The problem is he couldn't put it in. That old song. Ah, thou shalt not. Now, we did as Catholics. Under pain of sin, my parents were compelled to find a way to pay the tuition to put us in Catholic schools. This was the way the Catholic Mass was celebrated in my day. I had a real shocking moment when I went online looking for just generic nun pictures. And there they popped up, and those were the actual nuns who taught me in high school. You know, I still kind of, you know, because we had our moments. Our religion classes had little to say about the chaotic world beyond the schoolyard. I learned Catholic dogma from the little blue Baltimore Catechism and Christian ideals from revised editions of Butler's Lives of the Saints, with statements such as, quote, "The chains and prisons of the martyrs were their joy and glory, and the source of their grace and training." Well, that might be true. Every night in the early years when we still obeyed, we would hear Mama's call, "Rosary time." We usually gathered after homework and before bedtime. We knelt together on the hardwood floor of the living room before a plaster of Paris statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the centerpiece of the mantle. The ritual would begin with the sign of the cross and the Apostles' Creed, and then we would recite together either the sorrowful mysteries, the glorious mysteries, or the joyful mysteries, opening each of the 10 decades with an Our Father, then 10 Hail Marys, fingered on our own beads. Our neighbors peeked in the window at that a lot. It was quite the spectacle for them. We lived in the Baptist Bible Belt. Catholics were rare. And there were, you know, our neighbors. We had another Catholic, Lebanese Catholic family as neighbors, and their 10 kids, and we roamed the neighborhoods. Let's see, Sister Augustina, Sister Frances Ellen, Sister Amadeus, Sister Joan de Paul, all of those. They were probably really fine women trying to hurt us into compliance. This is the neighborhood. This is the neighborhood across Jackson Avenue, 1 block from my home. There was a big difference. I could see straight through these houses to the back of the shotgun houses. Every house, it seemed, had a bed in the living room. I knew we were poor, but our neighbors of color had it even worse. That's old Furry Lewis up there with his guitar. Y'all know good blues music. It's usually it's a series of rooms, usually 3, maybe a back porch. that you can look straight through from one window all the way to the back door. And usually in Memphis, they were side by side with no space in between. And, you know, 6, 8, 10 people crowded in those homes. Huh? They might be called that. We call them shotgun houses and other less kind words. We didn't call them that, but our neighbors called them. We'd get worn out if we used words. Okay. Y'all with me?
Yeah.
So we did the rosary every night. Came home from school. Sometimes we walked, sometimes we rode the Jackson bus. Not a lot of pictures of us kids. Film was pretty expensive. Mama had a good Kodak box camera. She took a lot of pictures, but a lot of them didn't get developed. She'd say, everybody out of the house and don't slam the door. And our outside games included most of the neighborhood children, and there were dozens loose on the street. That's the back of our house. These are old World War II cockpits. Daddy brought them home from the salvage store. We had a lot of fun with those. Most exciting was when our older brothers took them and they built rails from the low roof, and they'd climb up with one of those and you'd sit in and fly down. It was, we almost died on that. This is called a space trainer. I'm about 10 there, and I won it in a contest, but my mama was always entering us in contests. And you go round and round and round and round and round in it. But we figured out if we took it off the frame and rolled it down the hill, we would station a kid down at the end so we wouldn't roll into the street and just roll on down the hill. We had a lot of fun with that too. Those were the days, you know, you got let loose out on the city, and you learned, and my mama was very enterprising. And she was a college-educated woman. She'd been at a Catholic college called Siena College. Her mother died when she was very young, when she was about 3. So she ended up in a boarding school of nuns. So that kind of shaped her into a very principled person. She was a writer. She got her degree in journalism. She was a pilot. She flew airplanes before she married. She wrote a little bit about her life. She called it Before Dan Hanrahan. That was before 9 children. But anyway, she graciously did it. She wrote book reviews for both of the local newspapers. For 17 years she wrote book reviews, filled our shelves with books. Some like the Brothers Karamazov, other really heavy things. Yes.
Was she a military flyer?
No. She was a civilian before the war, and she worked in the Memphis Tower, and she flew a little project called a Taylor craft. Mom always entered contests. She won a lot. She won the Pillsbury Bake Off several times. We got stoves. We got stuff. She also, because we lived right on the route to the Mississippi, we were just 2 miles from the river, she had a worm ranch. And she turned that, I can remember, I can see those worms, I can still smell those worms. And we put out signs, in worms for sale, trying to make a little money. When she had to go out of the house to work, she ended up being the first fundraiser for the St. Jude Hospital, and we were part of the Teenagers March Against Leukemia, going door to door to door. And our best friends in the next Catholic family across the North Parkway were the Gaddis family. And they were part of the American Lebanese Association, ALSAC, that sponsored and brought Danny Thomas to Memphis. So we didn't know it, but we thought our mama was pretty important when she had a picture. Lawyer Dan. We don't have many pictures of Daddy, but that's pretty typical of him once he would get home. See, he'd have a paperback book in his pocket and a Roy Tan cigar in his mouth and always reading something. He was an extremely brilliant man, until the drinking takes you down, doesn't it, folks? And y'all know that. It takes a brilliant, brilliant soul and can really take him down. In the courtroom, Daddy, remember, he was raised in Brooklyn and New York. insisted that his Negro clients be addressed with the dignity of a title, Mr. or Mrs. The judges were usually calling them first name only, along the demeaning custom. Daddy was a smart man with a quick wit and ready smile. He had what someone once called an eidetic memory. He could quote large passages from the many law books that lined his office. When Daddy won a case, all seemed well for a while. It was fees or famine. It seemed Daddy's payment for legal services would sometimes come in barter. Once someone left a basket of freshly caught fish on the front porch. This led to a night of guts and gore in the kitchen sink as Daddy showed us how to prepare the fish for the frying pan. The scales were flying all over the kitchen counters and floors, and the bloody water filled the sink. I don't think Daddy cleaned it up. My sister Eileen remembers another time when Daddy's legal fee was paid with enough cucumbers to fill the bathtub. Where we washed them off before slicing them, putting them up in jars of vinegar. And we ate those sour cucumbers for a long time. Daddy lost his job when Henry Loeb, a wealthy Brown University graduate and former naval officer, was elected again in 1968. Loeb, like many in Memphis, upheld the genteel form of structural racism practiced by wealthy whites. Loeb was an avowed segregationist whose obdurate ways would be especially harmful during the sanitation workers' strike. Isn't it amazing how things don't change much? You had to hold a sign that said, "I am a man." Now folks have to hold a sign that says, "Black Lives Matter." Tell me how that's different. We have to hold a sign to declare our dignity as a human being. The work of collecting garbage was left to Negro men. Most were paid, now I should have capitalized that and put it in, most were paid less than $2 an hour. Sanitation workers Robert Walker and Echo Cole were ground up like garbage on a cold and rainy February in 1968. Those were orange trucks that came by our house all the time until the strike happened.
Did you mean that literally?
Absolutely, they were ground up like garbage. It was a rainy day, and they were standing on either side of the truck, because they have to put the garbage in. The compressor switch shorted, and the man in the driver's seat didn't realize it, and he sucked one in, and the other reached to get him and was sucked in as well. That's what sparked a labor movement that had been simmering for a long time in Memphis, but Memphis was not happy with labor unions because they were afraid of race mixing among laborers. That would upset the social order in our fair city. Okay, let's see. I bet I can find something. Around this time, I was 19 around this time. Here we go. During this time, I was a secretary at Anderson Clayton Cotton Company. I often walked along Main Street on my lunch hour, where striking workers and their allies paced single file up and down the sidewalk in front of department stores and other businesses. Their sandwich board placards read, "I am a man," and "Dignity and decency for our sanitation workers." Back at my desk, I overheard the racial slurs and the angry and fearful words of many of my employers and coworkers who were threatened by the changing times and hardened in their racist attitudes. On my bus rides to and from work, winding through the so-called colored neighborhoods, I saw the garbage piled outside houses, dumped in vacant lots, or spilled in the middle of the street. The unusually cold winter minimized the stench and reduced the threat of river rats feasting on the refuse. But the strike was taking a toll on the city. And there was the murder at the Lorraine Hotel. The young man here Larry Payne, 16-year-old, accused of looting, chased down by the police, cowering in a corner back in the housing project where his family was. Things are not changing very much, folks. Things are not changing very much. It was a summary execution. You know, we didn't have due process. And his family, his sister, approached him, went to touch her brother lying in the street. And the police stuck a shotgun in her belly and said, "Back off, Ann," to her. She recently spoke about that. But I put this in with Larry Payne because we have to call the names and we have to know that things are not changing very quickly. And we people who have privilege and relative power have a job to do. Dr. King was slain, of course, you all know that. Riots were breaking out in our city, this is Beale Street. The National Guard was there. You can't see very clearly, but those are tanks where they were riding. Next time I saw tanks like that patrolling city streets, it was in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Reminded me very much of Memphis in the 50s. I arrived home at dusk the night Dr. King was killed and heard the news. I may have caught the last available bus from downtown that night. Mama worked on South Main at the Fred P. Gaddis store just blocks from the Lorraine Hotel where the shooter was said to have taken aim. She too would have been making her way home by bus that night, passing the hotel where James Earl Ray had waited, rifle in hand. The alleged getaway car, a white Mustang, was said to be speeding east on Jackson Avenue, just blocks from our home. Our neighbors, Tommy and Jean, had a shortwave radio. My brother Michael remembers they listened to the police scanners reporting the pursuit of a white Mustang. Mama got off the bus at Jackson in Decatur. She later told Eileen that she'd seen a white car with men inside who were acting very suspicious. She reported it to the police, but never heard anything further. My brother Tommy, back from Vietnam then, talked about the out-of-town military men he had seen having drinks at a VFW or some such veterans club up the street just days before the assassination. So, how long will it take? How many more must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society? Coretta Scott King said that in front of the main building in Memphis. I went home that day when they were claiming they were having a memorial march. I was dismissed early from work. I walked home because they shut off all the buses. I couldn't understand my employers. They were saying, "Go home and get your rifles, the ends are marching." You know? They were frightened. Well, no buses were running. I walked home. I don't know what they were afraid of. They were 10 miles out with the white flag. So my sister Eileen and I came back. Walked back the 2 miles. It was cloudy and cool that afternoon, and we walked quickly down North Parkway to downtown. We arrived as the speakers were addressing mourners from the large scaffold platform set up in front of the new City Hall. Among the notable mourners was Senator Ted Kennedy, Dr. Benjamin Spock, Mrs. Rosa Parks. Soon after the speakers concluded, the assembly linked arms to sing "We Shall Overcome," then began the silent procession back down Main Street toward Beale. Eileen and I were swept up in a silent, breathing mass, 8 abreast, arms length. We walked down Main Street with a measured cadence between gauntlets of National Guard troops, bayonets affixed to rifles who lined the entire route. Some soldiers perched in the turrets of their M48 tanks. I could go on, but read the book. There's more to it. Now we know about Vietnam, don't we? You know those handsome young brothers of mine. Mama couldn't do a damn thing to keep them out of the Marine Corps. I mean, they won Junior Cook of the Year. They could cook some mean food. They were handsome, weren't they? All my girlfriends. Daniel, Joseph, and Thomas Patrick. We were all named after saints whose lives we were going to emulate. So, I find it nearly impossible even now to read about the Vietnam War. But for years I've stood with Veterans for Peace on public vigils, feeling the spirit of my war-wounded brothers on either side of me as I go into battle as a warrior for peace. As the American War on Vietnam continued, many young Memphis men were among the wounded and dead, too many for anyone to keep up with. And too many more whose deaths came later, as our brothers did, from the Agent Orange poison that lingered and killed them. Still killing folks. Ask some of these homeless people on the street. Agent Orange still killing. Those names were not etched on the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., nor on the memorial wall later erected in Memphis. A lot of grief in writing sometimes books. You know, brings up stuff that's unhealed still. A lot of hurt, a lot of anger. They were good men. They didn't deserve that. Now there's my daughter. I did get married. I did marry right out of, to get myself out of Memphis. I didn't pick very wisely. Let's see, I got a minute or two, a minute maybe, okay. Y'all bear with me, I'm really close. Throughout my marriage, I longed to return to college. I found my opportunity at El Centro in Dallas, earning tuition part-time. My relationship was in steady decline. Jessica's father offered little support of my efforts to finish, and I carried most of the burden of after-hours child care and housework. My consciousness had been raised by the women's liberation movement. But pursuing women's liberation principles and putting them into practice with an uncooperative and unfaithful husband was quite another story. Divorce was an ugly word, and the reality even more so in the 1970s. I had no preparation for this change in status. Despite all my efforts to save the marriage, I knew I would find no solace or support from the Catholic Church, and little sympathy from my you make your bed, you lie in it family, whose warnings I had ignored. I was a divorcee. And if I were to die then, in the custom of the day, that would be the first descriptor after my name in any obituary. Well, she's a lovely girl, that daughter of mine. She's married, got 2 beautiful children, lives way far away in Texas. She said, Nashville's not big enough for both of us, Mama. So I got a little feisty. In Memphis, the white train carrying nuclear warheads was coming through. So that's me looking up at the police there. Now this is one issue that caused both my mom and my daughter a hassle when I did this, because I didn't prepare them well. Mama found it on the 5 o'clock news when I was being hauled away by the SWAT team. And Jessica had to endure from the sidelines. We really thought they would pull us off the track before that train carrying nuclear warheads came through our city. But they waited. Finally, it stopped. We also, my daughter and I, went and founded a shelter for homeless women and children in Florida, and we worked and volunteered in some in Memphis. Some things never change, do they? We got to carry the same damn signs, don't we? So then I got a little feisty and wanted to live off the grid. We built a catamaran, and that story's in here, going down the Mississippi. It's a great river to go down. We lived in a teepee for a while, up in Hawkins County, Tennessee. Our journey began at dawn on a wing and a prayer, borne by the vagrant winds and the river's steady flow. I could tell you more, it's in here. It's a great story. It was a great trip, too. Then I had to figure out what was going on in Belfast. So my daughter's in college. She's out at, I think she was at Warren Wilson then, maybe Antioch, I forget. She tried her hand at both. So I went to Belfast. Wow. They said I had a fool's pardon because I was crossing back and forth through the peace walls, so-called peace walls, followed, often followed. I couldn't tell how they could tell each other apart. It was easier in Memphis. You know, you knew you're supposed to hate these people people, not these people, but in Belfast it was a little different. It was what names they were called. Some said it was how their eyes slanted. Mostly it was their loyalty to England and their loyalty to that and their fear of the Catholic overtaking the entire island. But there were lots of stuff going on in Belfast. That's a good story too. I met some interesting people. And then I spent a little time in the federal prison at Alderson. I was in one of those big barracks, and that was my cubicle. It looks just like that. I was on the top floor. If you want to read about that, Conscience and Consequence, I'll tell you about that. And next steps, I'd say we make books, not war. And I've got many more stories to tell, and I know all of you do too. You got stories. You got stories, and you know, when we tell our stories, we write the history of people's history. We make sure it's heard. And we need to do that. It's important. Oh, here, things don't change, do they? Y'all hear about all the citations being issued recently? Well, heck, I got 3 for Occupy. They dropped the charges on 2 and caught me, nabbed me on 1. That's just down the street. Yeah. Yeah. Aren't that dangerous? May you have the commitment to harvest your life, to heal what has hurt you, to allow it to come closer to you and become one with you. From the great Irish writer John O'Donoghue, a blessing for old age. Thank you.